Okay, this is just a boring old paper, as opposed to that. I didn't even bring a puppet. Okay. In part, this is a love letter to this novel that I just found so freaking amazing. John Edward Durham's 2021 novel, Winterset Hollow, is a poetic, dark fairy tale that reveals the gruesome reality behind a fictional children's book, Winterset Hollow. Quote, Winterset Hollow was the story of a community of animals that never saw a sour day until an ever-curious rabbit named Runnymede poked his nose outside of their sacred grounds and spooked a pack of war-weary buffalo that were moving west in search of better lands and sweeter food. As in a fairy tale, the monsters are mythic and metaphorical and disturbingly familiar. Durham traps modern characters in the exquisitely elegant waste of early 20th century consumerism, and they can only hope to survive the monsters created a century ago by the book's abusive author. The terrible beauty of the novel is less the protagonist's disillusionment at understanding the violence and appetites of the man who wrote such charming children's literature, and more that character's abject wonder that the creatures from his favorite children's book exist. His world is literally rewritten by the fairy tale animals from the beloved book. But of course, they are monsters. Horror critic Noel Carroll's idea that the monster is an ordinary character in an extraordinary world works, in this case, to rewrite the nature of the world the human characters know. The monsters, whether they be maimed and tortured once humans or fantastic sentient animals commodified and warped by abuse, function in their medieval sense to demonstrate. The truth these monsters tell, the truth the human characters experience, is the revelation and abject wonder of the real world's horror hidden in a children's story, the story of capitalism and colonialization and commodification. At its best, horror eviscerates the audience with beauty as its weapon, or perhaps it uses truth, beauty's doppelganger. Winterset Hollow is laced with that frisson of truth, that spidery kiss of the abject. The novel features a human-sized rabbit who has been dressed, in multiple senses of the word, by humanity. First, by 20th century touch, his clothing fits both his anthropomorphized children's book rabbit frame and dressed in hunting terms. He has been prepared for future culinary disposal. He's also been metaphorically skinned and psychologically gutted, severed from his world, his natural landscape, and original culture, the true Winterset Hollow. Oh, and he was forced to cut off his own leg so that the man who had captured and imprisoned him, the children's book Winterset Hollow's author, John B. Addington, yeah, that guy, could eat his leg as part of a fine meal at a dinner party prepared by the rabbit's dear friend, quote, that night, Edward and his guests had quite the supper, English peas and mash on the side. I was still young, so I'm sure it was tender, particularly with Blackwell in the kitchen. While this monster rabbit walks and talks and grabs at agency with his mutilated body, he has in essence suffered the same fate as all those other non-speaking creatures on public display, hunted, stuffed, beheaded, and taxidermied in the great hall of Addington's mansion on his private island. Runny the Rabbit, a central figure in Addington's Winterset Hollow, which gives Durham's novel its title. Runny is the traumatized survivor of both that fictional story and the brutal actuality of Addington's actions. He is the rabbit in the rye, a richly written counterpart to Eamon Buckley, a Homo sapien, or as Runny calls them, the anthropomorphic monkeys. A human plucked out of a survivalist childhood, living off the land, learning wood lore. Eamon is the novel's protagonist and much more, which he comes to learn throughout Durham's novel. Eamon is a hollowhead, a massive fan of Winterset Hollow, who's come to visit the author's estate, along with his two best friends and another handful of 20 to 30-somethings who are part of the book's fan culture. Both Runny and Eamon survived abusive father figures. For the man, this meant a blood relative who kept him living in a primitive cabin in the woods, followed by that father's abandonment and the child's introduction to the 21st century by way of foster homes. For the rabbit and his fellows, the abusive father figure meant E.B. Addington, and later, the inheritance of an island, an estate, the physical trappings of early to mid-20th century luxury and wealth. It meant the inheritance of the same corruption and the putrid appetites of Addington's cultural ethos. The rabbit, the bear, the fox, and the frog, each classic fairy tale figures in their own right, are the only survivors of their kind. Sentient and long-lived, they sacrificed themselves to go with Addington in exchange for his promise to leave their land alone, the real geographical hollow. And they left their kith and kin safe, sentient forest creatures with art and morals and language and culture. What Eamon finds at the end of the novel is that Addington double-crossed those creatures that he took, as evidenced by a room full of his taxidermied wrath. Quote, rabbits and foxes, bears and frogs and owls and countless others frozen in death, their eyes still wide with terror and their mouths agape as if they were slain mid-scream. As Runny says, showing the room to Eamon, my brothers and sisters, my mother and father, every friend I ever made, every creature I'd ever quarreled with, every acquaintance to whom I'd ever given a nod, and every paw I'd ever shaken. This slaughter is the sentient creatures' motivation for their Barley Day hunt, in which they turn the tables on the young men and women, the hollowheads, fans of the novel, who've been lured to Addington's 100-year-old mansion. The sentient animals hunt the humans, demanding that the humans repay a debt and reenacting a version of their own treatment at Addington's hands. The bear beats them to death. The fox outsmarts them and knifes them. The frog shoots them with a slingshot, and Runny uses a rifle. Durham carefully plots and then reveals that the orphan Eamon is, in fact, the last of Addington's bloodline. Thus, if the creatures are successful, then they would have taken out Addington's family, just as he committed a genocide on theirs. Now, whereas Addington created a vast, locked gallery of death to enjoy the corpses, the real inhabitants of Winterset Hollow, the sentient animals create statues of their kills, placed around the grounds of the estate, each one a member of Addington's bloodline that they have hunted and murdered, child or adult. As Runnymede says, Edward always did enjoy his trophies, and to be honest, I never understood the fascination. But I do now. I do indeed. He says this, showing Eamon the taxidermied corpse of Edward B. Addington, a gun in one hand, a pen in the other. That author is the exception to his victims' trophies demonstrated as statues. This one is placed amid the sentient creatures he has killed, a final trophy amid trophies. But Addington's biggest trophy is, of course, the book he wrote. Hence the animal's placement of that pen as a weapon parallel to the gun. Addington's book, his Winterset Hollow, is perhaps as brutal a theft as the lives of all the sentient animals that he took for trinkets. Quote, he took from us the only thing we had left, our memories. The book that everyone loves is a corruption and a commodification of the sentient creature's own history. The geography of the Hollow, it's a real place, literally bought and then metaphorically sold by Addington. He possesses it, decorates the walls with it, but then he co-opts the memory, the history, even the mystery of it by writing this children's book. He demonstrates this monstrous authority by flattening his characters' lives and creating his own people as heroic and peace-loving. The human readers, quote, made him, Edward, into a god built on the back of unimaginable cruelty. And they love him, they did. They celebrate him, they did. And revere him, they did. Victors write history, Durham seems to be reminding us, and they may be writing it even while the survivors are still living it. Instead of the Addington fairy tale version in which the sentient creatures live happily with the buffalo, thinly disguised white hunters in the Pacific Northwest, whom they invite into their world. The Winterset Hollow community is, in fact, of course, hanging on the walls of Addison's mansion. They are the trinkets that Addington explains are his due as king of his domain, quote, as Addington himself writes, I shan't shy away from it. I have given the world a beautiful thing, and so it only seems proper that I should be able to take from it a trinket or two that would make me feel lively and separate from the rest. Durham's plot clearly demonstrates an allegory, theft of indigenous people's lands, co-opting, commodification of a culture's history and ritual. Quote, Edward purchased our land, not from us, mind you, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, he wasn't shy about reminding us that if we ever set a foot towards home, he would bring our kin in by the wagon load, stack their bodies on the patio for us to gut before he had them stuffed. So no, we never tried to leave. But these fantastic creatures, sentient anthropomorphic animals in the fairy tale tradition, these traumatized monsters, the ones the readers empathize with, are still brutal. The sentient animals function to have the reader think about colonized folk, psychologically warped over decades of abuse into desires and actions that mimic their colonizers. Adorno's mimic man writ large, albeit with fur. The sentient animals' actions, the hunting, the torture of individual buffalo, the creation of trophies, these are inversions of their original lives and the core culture of Winterset Hollow. They are moved from a communal culture, which might be considered extraordinary to the reader, not merely for its biology, but for its very humanity, as well as its celebration and embrace of the natural world. Then, having been caged, brought out to be hunted by Addington's friends and family, and treated as things for decades, their commitment to having their own hunt and to destroying Addington's bloodline is finally a commitment to their family motto, honor thy family. It is why they hunt humans, Edward's buffalo. Want a little more abject wonder? Eamon's heart almost burst when he saw the rye stretching for acres in every direction, the instinct to sit himself down in the middle of it, wrap his arms around his knees and simply be. It was pervasive and timeless peace. He felt for the first time in his life that he was part of the axis instead of just a piece of the wheel. Eamon and Caroline are the ones who most revere the book for what it gave them as children, a sense of hope. Quote, the abject wonder of feeling lost in a favorite story. Both Eamon and Caroline were awash in the fantasy of finding some brand new chapter. Eamon's heart beats double time when he sees the silhouette of Runny, but his mind, quote, simply wouldn't allow him to process it as anything other than madness. Before him stood one inarguable answer and 100 burning questions. Good evening, the old rabbit said, to the abject astonishment of everybody present. It was still enough to make the edges of Eamon's reality bleed white and beg his vision to pulse with his still racing heart. Surely this was madness. Surely this was anything but real. He wanted to believe these things for the sake of faith in his own perspective, but he wanted to believe their inverses for the sake of so much more. What makes this experience abject, that vortex of attraction and repulsion, may be exactly what Caroline and Eamon have to give up to experience the sublime event. They have to void the very perspective that drives the book they love, the words they adore. The metaphorical and safely abstract has just introduced itself as the literal. When Finn, the game master and hunter, begins his killing spree, he accuses the humans of, quote, living your lives in service to somebody else's words, unquote. And that is exactly what they have done. Their abject wonder at meeting the creatures begins to release them, but at such a cost. Addington's fantastic, twisted co-option of the sentient creature's history and culture has been the core of love, happiness, and joy for these people. They came to Addington's estate to experience the geographical touchstones from the purloined story. They can see, touch, and feel the riches as Eamon strokes the body of a stuffed white tiger, just as he touched Runny's hip. This is the 20th century collection of an absurdly rich man, from exquisite porcelain and crystal to Van Gogh and Picasso, a proper robber baron's lair, complete with the inherited wealth built over time. As Runny says, offerings of the rich in brass and offerings of the poor in blood. The overabundance of a collector, a hoarder, the amassed wealth of privileged generations honor thy family. It is upon this great pile that Addington sat, a medieval dragon on his hoard. Like the king of late capitalism he saw himself to be, inviolate, a man of ultimate authority. As Runny sees him, Edward, the great white hunter, Edward, the noblest king in the court. And Edward knows his own reflection. Quote, I was born a king and I shall die a king, as I see nowhere above where I reign for me to climb, and no pit below where I stand, into which I could conceivably fall. I have no choice but to indulge my interests, however unsavory I might find them. Why should a castle have walls if not for them to be adorned? I am as put upon as any man, the only difference being between me and them is that I have the means to indulge these things and the status to be free of the consequences. This horror, a human, mad with power, a genuine monster for the 20th century, is the deified, heroized engine of his reading public's joy. His singular rapaciousness sits at the heart of what Eamon and Caroline and everyone thought was communal plenty. And the vacuum of Addington's greed and all its ramifications, genocide, slavery, inherited trauma, abuse, all of this supplants the survivors' joy, love, hope, salvation. The survivors are left figuratively and literally with Addington's hollow, the gnawing memory of their experiences, their trauma. They are left with an abject wonder at that emptiness, quote, they had always been so good at keeping each other whole, but now there was a pit in the middle of each of them that the others simply could not know how to fill. And so they had no choice but to leave them empty. Thank you.
Next, we have Ariane, Helou, Kathy Thomas, and Jessica Calvanico. Their paper is called Immortal You, Creating and Critiquing a Feminist Comic Multiverse. Kathy, do you want a third mic?
We can move it.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I hope so, but we have to move the PowerPoint. Right, that's the thing. Yeah. Yeah. And yes.
Hi, it is So great to be here. We are, all three of us, graduates of UCSC's doctoral programs in literature and feminist studies, between the two of us. So it's really nice to be back on campus. I'm going to start by introducing the project, saying a little bit about its background, its genesis, and some of the sort of thematic concerns at the base of it. Then I'm going to hand it over to Kathy to talk about the narrative structure and world building that we're trying to create, and then Jessica will talk a little bit about the sort of future directions of the project and what we hope to accomplish in the long term. So Immortal You is the title of a comic book that we are writing. And like so many projects that many of us are working on right now, this was a pandemic baby. During COVID, especially in the early days, beginning in the spring of 2020, the three of us were members of a writing group that met on Zoom every single day. It was amazing for staying sane, having some human connection, and also very, very productive and very inspiring. The members of the group happened to be mostly women, all academics at various career stages, from grad student all the way to tenured professor. And it also happened that many of us were on the academic job market during that time. So we had a lot of conversations, about work, about the state of the world, but there were certain things that we kept coming back to over and over again. We kept talking about power structures, both interpersonal and institutional, and in particular the way that powerful individuals can have outsized influences over somebody's career trajectory, their public reputation. We talked a lot about women, gender, and feminism, the constant negotiations that one engages in, constantly or not, when moving through the world as a female identifying person, and particularly the way that that affected labor, both professionally and domestically, during the pandemic period. We talked a lot about academic precarity. As I said, many of us were navigating the academic job market at this time, which, if you know, enough said about that. And then finally, the question of who controls the narrative. And we were thinking, both in terms of the big scope of narrative of what was happening with the pandemic and happening, nationally and globally, and at the same time, the narrative of within the context of our professional world, who succeeds and who doesn't, what does a successful career look like, what's at stake, and all of that. At the same time, Kathy and I happened to be quarantining in adjacent neighborhoods in LA, and we would often go for long walks around the La Brea tar pits, which is a site full of fabled prehistoric monsters. You probably can't read it because it's quite small, but the sign that is slapped onto the flank of the giant ground sloth says, "Caution, playground closed for COVID-19." And so during these walks, we, sort of like the conversation from the writing Zoom would carry over. More concerns about academia, also, finding ourselves in the middle of LA and spending a lot of time watching TV and movies during COVID, as we all did. We talked too about the monsters of Hollywood, right? This ongoing dialogue about power and how it can infiltrate many kinds of professions. So this ongoing dialogue about power and control and narrative planted the seed for an idea for a comic book, a satire that would use literal gods and monsters taken from ancient mythology and use them to enact the machinations of the monstrous and godlike power players in the real world. We could have set this story in any kind of context, and we decided on academia because that's the one that we know most intimately. And soon after that, Jessica came on board as our third co-author. And then we also all our birthdays happened to be within a couple weeks of each other. So at some point when we were on sort of like communal birthday celebration high, Kathy said, "Hey, let's make this an all Aquarius project and see what happens." So we have 3 Aquarian co-authors, and it will be very interesting to see how that affects our working process, if that affects our working process. So we conceived Immortal You as an experiment in form, in genre, and tone, and I guess also it's a bit of an astrological experiment, if you're into that. Through retellings of ancient myths, Immortal You interrogates how the power dynamics that shaped their origins, that shape the origins of these myths, also formed and continue to shape modern academia. So the questions that we are trying to explore with this project: what kind of monster is born from power? How does power feed into monstrosity? What kinds of gendered behaviors are people, especially women, expected or pressured to perform in academia? What makes a dangerous or monstrous woman, or really a dangerous or monstrous person of any gender identity? And who shapes the narrative around monstrosity? So because I am a good classicist, I want to take us back to the etymology of the word monster, which, you know, those of us who, many people here who work a lot in monster studies are probably familiar with this, but it's always worth remembering. Monster, it comes into English through the Old French, monstre, but it comes originally from Latin. This, and there are sort of two origins, right? There's the noun monstrum, which means an omen or a monster. That is derived in turn from the verb moneo, which means warn. But moneo, that also gives us a different verb, monstro, which means show or point out. So that's also kind of a cognate here. So in the etymology of the word monster, we have the idea of a warning or cautionary tale. And also that's something that demands to be seen, demands to be pointed out. And one of the reasons that we chose Medusa, pictured here in the famous sculpture by Bernini, as the protagonist of our first issue is because her particular, you know, like many figures in ancient mythology, her monstrous appearance or monstrous aspect isn't something she's born with, but it's a transformation that she is forced to undergo as a punishment for something that happened to her. So Medusa's monstrosity, her ability to turn somebody into stone with her gaze, right? It both embodies and enacts the compulsion to see and to be seen, while also implicating the tension that results when someone refuses to comply with this compulsion. So Medusa is in many ways the ultimate monstrous woman. I'm sure the story is familiar to most of us, but just to recap, if you haven't read it for a while, she was one of the three Gorgon sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Medusa was the only one of the three who was mortal. She was raped by the god Poseidon in the temple of the goddess Athena. And Athena was so offended by this that she punished Medusa, not Poseidon, but Medusa, by turning her hair into snakes and giving her the power to turn people to stone with her gaze, so turning Medusa herself into a kind of deadly weapon. And as scholars, we take seriously the literary and cultural histories of these mythological figures that we'll be reimagining, but at the same time, we are embracing our liberty as creative writers to reimagine those figures in ways that is most exciting and most conducive to our narrative goals. So in the first issue of Immortal You, some of our aims with the Medusa narrative is to center Medusa's experience as a victim of sexual assault who is then punished for perceived transgressions. And as we all know, this is something that happens in the real world every day. We want to try to subvert the long and deeply misogynistic tradition that equates Medusa's monstrosity, the snakes, the gaze, with evil and with emasculation, which is the theory put forward famously by Freud, right? That he reads the Medusa story as something like a castration anxiety. And to explore the power systems and hierarchies that make a modern day Medusa, as we're imagining her in our narrative context, vulnerable. So this project is already so heavily intertextual. We want to try to avoid over-theorizing our own work. We would like the story to speak for itself because this is a comic book, not a scholarly essay. That said, we can't entirely put aside our critical theorist selves. We are, after all, products of UC Santa Cruz's intellectual training. All three of us are well-versed in feminist theory as a tool for understanding gender and sexuality. So as a catch-all term for kind of the argument of our project, we want to go one step beyond feminism and offer the concept of Gorgonism. We're thinking about this as a framework for considering both gender and monstrosity together. In other words, a feminine monstrous alterity. We think that this will be useful for our overarching project of both reclaiming Medusa from a victimhood narrative and for addressing the question of who is the real monster. In other words, what makes a monster? Is it Medusa or is it Poseidon, whose assault led to her metamorphosis and exile? And we'll come back to that idea in later sections of the talk. So now I'm going to pass the baton to Kathy to talk more about the next phase of the project.
The lecture hall is the new temple, the lectern its altar. The college campus, the college campus with its offerings of young dewy bodies and active receptive minds gives once forgotten immortals a fresh and constant supply of devotees. But the temple will always be an unsettled place for Medusa. When Medusa was a young girl, she was chased into Athena's temple and raped by Poseidon. For this desecration of the temple's purity and thus her reputation, the goddess Athena turned Medusa and her two immortal sisters, Euryale and Stheno, into the Gorgons, a head of snakes for each of them, but wings for her sisters. So even after their fantastical transfigurations, Medusa would always be grounded to the mundane fact of her mortality, her vulnerability, her inability to fly away from danger when it approached a second time. Years pass, and a young man wanting to protect his mother from another sexual aggressor sets off on a quest to find Medusa. Perhaps he seeks Medusa for advice on behalf of his own mother. He needs to know how to say no to a king. But since that did not work for Medusa and the king of the seas, he is instead in need of her assistance to stop his enemies stone dead in their tracks. A buddy movie. You're rubber, she's glue. Everything you say bounces off of Medusa and calcifies you. And perhaps the two young people would smile together as they watch King Polydectes turn to stone, knowing a woman is now free to walk without having to look over her shoulder. But no. There's no precedent for a friendship. It's just another hunt for another kind of head. A monster's head. This is Perseus. This is a hero. This is his story. This is how you read a woman's body as a wound to be carried, a weapon to be abused. Like many myths that get told and retold, only bits and pieces are remembered over time. Mouths and campfires are replaced by books and screens. Gods serve the hashtag blessed. With yoga mats and lattes, God served false prayer circles in the desert at music festivals. God served the epigraph of a never-read dissertation of an expert on gods. The gods grow weaker and hungrier every day. On Olympus, most have accepted this twist of fate called modernity. Most except two, egotistical Zeus and reputation-driven Athena. Gather various immortals across global and spiritual pantheons to rekindle their glory. Using the setting of the modern university, they create Olympus University to sit amongst another pantheon with Oxford, Harvard, the Sorbonne, the UCs, and the like. At Olympus University, the offerings and sacrifices are constant. Many immortals rematerialize on Earth, taking up various positions in personae on and off of campus. They take up appearances that suit their needs. For example, Zeus, the ever-indecisive and lecherous god, has chosen to be two things. First, the beloved house pug of the Delta Gamma Theta sorority, and also a provost. The rules are these. Only immortals are aware of their past, others are not, and the past must stay intact to build the world and to strengthen the gods. Thus, it seems as if the monsters, heroes, and other mere mortals are part of their ancient stories, are predestined to live versions of shop-worn plots without knowing their own pasts or fates. Olympus University is protected by a masking spell called the Sheathing, It's a cosmic coding that allows Olympus to get inserted into our reality without affecting our space-time continuum. It also allows mortals to look upon gods without going blind or going mad. Immortals can see each other's true forms. A cross-pantheon collective called the Markers manages the sheathing. However, all's not well in this new temple. Medusa is a young professor at Olympus University living among her demons. Medusa's true story, how a god hurt a girl, how a girl becomes strong, was always hers to tell. It's a story so powerful with its feminine, monstrous alterity that it will create a ripple in the sheathing, a glitch to the system, a fault in their stars. Can Athena stop her monster from becoming a hero? Can Medusa make a better world out of Olympus? Or will Olympus University be its own worst enemy? Who controls the narrative controls the world. So we intentionally, for us, it was very important to expand our universe, create a multiverse that included different global and spiritual pantheons. So we have like the Yoki Onna, who's like one of my favorite mythological figures. She's a snow witch. Urzuli the Gagged. We have, Kapo from Hawaii. When we are thinking about Olympus as being its own worst enemy, this means that there are growing tensions between sort of the gods in the Greek pantheon and the non-Western canon gods who are helping them with this scheme originally, but start to be disenchanted or doubt the mission as the plot line gets darker. But also it's the tension between Western and non-Western thought in a particular space. And when we're thinking about monstrous feminine alterity, we are trying to center narratives from the marginalia into the center. So we'll be writing about the gray eye, Nemezene, the victims of transfigurations like Ariadne and Daphne, the Pythia, the Maenads, and others who might decorate people's walls, might decorate their skin in ink tattoos, but they won't have titles or narratives that focus on them. Our tone, again, is satire. It's, if this was on Netflix, it would be satire, offbeat, witty, social commentary, drama. And we definitely would need to have a disclaimer that this fiction is purely coincidental, any similarities. Because we know who we are, and we don't want our friends and colleagues to be like, we can't talk to her because she's going to put us in the next issue. But we are very aware of who we are and where we are functioning. But there is definitely no coincidence that comic books are just the perfect storytelling system to make our audience laugh, cringe, and feel generally paranoid. So the goal and challenge, the challenge for us will be to not create a niche world of academics who are infighting, but to have a broader commentary on systems, systems and our own relationships to those systems, and people that continue to do harm in the name of reputation, also in the name of entitlement. So that's the story.
I'm going to be talking a little bit about the future directions of the project. So thank you, Ariane and Kathy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the series structure, delve a little bit deeper into monstrous feminine alterity, and make some connections to our contemporary moment as well. So the series structure, this is kind of just getting into the nitty-gritty of how we're seeing the project. We're thinking of it as a 12-issue project that features 3 standalone so-called one-shot in the comic world stories, or what we're calling the Tale of Tales. These are kind of backstories to specific characters important to our narrative, but who deserve a little bit, or who we're thinking deserve a little bit more of an in-depth character study. And each of these stories will also sort of help provide context and more information on sort of the world-building project that we're endeavoring on. So, a couple of examples. is maybe like linking, and this is also a place where we can link some of the sort of non-Western gods to the Western ones, or also other historical figures, historical and mythic figures to each other. So, thinking of how La Llorona and Medea might overlap, and perhaps giving backstory to the Pythia, framing who she is, or who the many Pythias have been. Every fourth issue we'll write collectively, and issue 1 will be this kind of what we're seeing as a master narrative with some flashback and interstitial narratives within them. So we're also thinking about our, inspiration. Obviously, Kathy talked about how the comic is this perfect form for the tone of this project, which we're seeing as a satire, but we're able to, speak to and about the university and bring it to this broader sort of audience. So, we're really inspired by comics that are doing similar kinds of things, and I just want to name drop a couple. The Wicked and the Divine is one, if you're familiar. Promethea by Alan Moore, and even League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and then also Neil Gaiman's Sandman, right? This kind of comics that are interrogating these mythic characters and archetypes and putting them into situations in the so-called real or contemporary world. And this kind of brings us to, as well, part of our intended audience, which Ariane really touched on. We're thinking, of course, this could speak to comic fans, right? This is for a broader audience. But also mythology fans, which there are many, and contemporary television and film as well is really interrogating some of these things. But also, of course, academics. We're hoping that there's the niche audience of the academic who will be intrigued by the setting. So I just want to kind of now talk a little bit about the future directions, theorizing some of these. This meant to say interventions instead of inventions. I fixed it last night, but I think it was too late. So this is obviously where we're trying to think about the theoretical interventions and the argument and sort of how we see that emerging. So Ariane kind of mentioned this, idea of, well, she more than mentioned it, this idea of the monstrous feminine alterity and how we're theorizing Gorgonism. And one of the things that I wanted to think about here, and what I hope that the project can kind of do and interrogate, is the idea of Gorgonism, right, as a kind of, as a feminist take on this trope, right, of the monstrous feminine, which it already was by Barbara Creed's and, kind of critiquing Freud's idea. But what's really fascinating about this idea is that we're kind of also emphasizing the Gorgonism as a sisterhood or a kind of coalition, right? So we might also see this as a form of and a way to theorize a kind of coalition feminism. It's across monstrosity, also across difference. So, right, it's a kind of monstrous feminist collective, if you will, tied to others that are also engaged in this kind of, or characterized as monsters. And what we can kind of do with that theorization is really compelling to me, particularly. And another thing that I think is fascinating, just speaking to the monstrous and monstrous feminine alterity, right, is the idea of the gaze, but not necessarily that the gaze is, right, just this form of death. There's also this tie to sexuality. So obviously Medusa, when one looks upon her, they turn into stone, right? So Freud is really interested in this idea of the feminine genitalia or the female genitalia, right, equaling emasculation, this kind of a penis envy idea. However, I'm really compelled by the sort of underlying idea of like the sexual desire within that, right? So when someone looks upon Medusa, anybody is turned into stone, literally turned into a rock-hard object that could replace a phallus, which is a quite compelling concept. And all of her sisters are also have this power. So these are some of the ideas that, we're kind of thinking about, how sexual control comes into this, how sexual desire is linked to the death drive, but also how sexual desire is linked to objection, right? And there's a kind of interrogation of gender roles through sexuality that basically emerge within this idea of petrification. Of course, as both Kathy and Ariane talked about, we're ultimately really concerned with and thinking about the power of narrative, right? History and myth as control and power. And what happens once these characters remember, particularly the mortal ones, right? Remember what happened to them, right? So if Medusa's really able to, at one point, sort of start to break through the sheath, she recalls her trauma, and she's able to tell a different story. We're able to emphasize, right, what Perseus did, the sort of backstory of Poseidon, how she got to be what she is, and she becomes a different kind of character. And the story changes, right? And who is able to relate to her, what those stories can do, becomes a site of possibility and healing, but also transformation. And this really kind of brought us to some questions about tying to this sort of contemporary moment. So, of course, it engages a kind of world building at the university, right? We're taking the university as our site to explore some of these ideas, which is rife with its own power structures and toxic politics. However, it's also the site of a lot of toxic politics in today's world, of course, right-wing and fascist assaults on critical race theory, on African American studies and Black studies, and just US history, at least, right? All of the, and then also, of course, we see this through banning books, attacks on trans kids, attacks on drag performances and drag in general, and trans people in general, not just kids, but definitely kids become the sort of locus of that political argument. So we're really kind of interested in asking some of these questions so we can also engage in this conversation, right? Which quite literally asks us to remember the story in a different way. Actually, not even in a different way, but to really remember what the actual story is, right? Medusa experiences sexual assault, and that's what makes her this monster. A fact that, well, I'm sure everyone in this room knows, right? It's not necessarily the dominant narrative that you hear about Medusa. So what does it mean to illuminate those kinds of backstories and tell a different story? We're thinking of it in context of these sorts of projects that are really allowing us to interrogate our own histories and bringing to light some of those really important narratives that get sanitized and politically are, targeted for a kind of literally whitewashing. So that kind of brings me to just wrap up some of this, but we just created, literally just created a Instagram. So please if you're interested, follow along. We're currently looking for an artist, so if you have any suggestions, we are all ears and would like to chat with anyone. Unfortunately, none of us are equipped enough to be the artist of this comic, although that would have been really convenient. And yeah, you don't have to be an Aquarian, although maybe we prefer that. But please let us know. We're also open to any ideas or questions or comments or just, suggestions. We're obviously this is in its nascent form, and we're just really excited to be able to do this as a group of scholars and friends and nerds. So yeah, thank you so much.
Everything that they know from their students. So I'm so impressed and psyched. And and actually would like to be in your comic. So I'm not, I'm like the other.
Who do you want to be?
Who do you want to be?
I don't know. I want you to surprise me, but I am not the one who's going to shy away. I want to be someone.
Done.
Yeah, I want to be someone really exciting. Not the evil power associated with the provost.
No, not
You would
Demon
never
kind
be.
of
You
thing.
would never be.
So thank you, very exciting. I want to just open it up now to questions for any of the panelists. It's really fascinating talks, and I think actually some interesting potential convergences, which since I'm not actually a respondent, I don't have to make. I'm going to open it up to you to do that, and Renee is going to start us off.
It's on. Oh, now it's definitely on. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Also, I would also like to be in your comic if
There we
I
go.
can be. So just put me
We
there
take
too.
requests. We do.
Thank you all for this fantastic panel. And my question is kind of for everyone, because the panel is called Remaking Myths. We put you all together because you're all working on that project in some way, but you're all talking about the remaking or the reimagining or the kind of getting back to an original version of myths. But the remaking is happening in very different formal ways. So Sharon, you and Kurt are doing this in theatrical form in a quite deliberately performative way. Frank, you're talking about this very kind of like meta novel about the ways in which a writer kind of like re-intervenes in their character. So this kind of meta fictional form. And Kathy, Ariane, and Jessica, you're talking specifically about comics, and you discussed a little bit about the influences of various comics or the kinds of comics that you're interested in. But I wondered if the three of you and everyone else on your panel might talk a little bit about specifically about the forms and the affordances of the forms that you are choosing, or that the writers you're talking about are choosing to remake those myths. The meta narrative, the performative, and the combination of of image and text that you find in comic books, because I think that these very different forms are all doing quite different work for all of you.
No, I thought you were going to start. Okay.
Well, originally, we had proposed to do a very short film, taking images and also live action, because we had the costume. We ran into every possible roadblock, including actors' strike and voiceover strike and other issues which are technical and I won't get into. But in any case, so we actually, maybe about 2.5 months ago, said, you know what, let's do it live. And I said, we don't have time to do an 8-minute play, and we actually don't even have the characters for it, all of them. So this is what I came up with literally overnight. And I just heard Sir Mix-a-Lot in my head and came up with an homage. It's not a parody, it's an homage. I ran it by Kurt, and he was shocked. I've never done anything like this before. So, yeah, I mean, I played with it, but it literally was, what can we do? What can we do in a short form specifically for this? But it's actually a little longer, but it was done for this conference. I'm used to taking texts and making them, creating them for modern audiences while really respecting the kind of the idea behind it, but also playing with it a lot. And I hope that's what came across. So that's more or less what I have to say on it. Kurt, do you have anything to add? No. He was just like, Wow, okay, that's different.
I'll pitch in just a little bit if I might, and that is, and I think this answers your question, kinda, maybe sideways. Something that happens in the book. There's a line in the book where the rabbit says, the rabbit says, stasis has its own pain, its own problems. And something that struck me about, I think, what everybody is saying is the fluidity of the monstrous is its strength, its openness to change, as opposed to that petrification, as opposed to that frozen narrative, which maybe we are all engaging with. We're going, no, there's another way to see the fluidity of the monstrous as generative, as strength, as inherently revised, and maybe, transforming under the full moon or not. That's all I got.
Well, I think that we were very interested. Well, I know Kathy and I are big comic book fans, so that was sort of we've been talking about this for a decade almost at this point, and just wanting to work on a comic together. But I think the form really, and just because we love comics, but I think the form really helps speak to the kind of audience that we're looking at, an intersection of really varied groups, one being, academics, as we mentioned, another being, well, who would be really interested in mythology, obviously mythology fans, but also, right, this is a topic that's been discussed and interrogated in different comics before, so it really just made a lot of sense. However, I think the integration of the graphic, the visual with the textual really helps because Medusa is, right, such a hyperscopic monstrous. And I think one of the things that's really delightful about her as a character is the ways in which one of the things we all did is pulled pictures of Medusa in various forms, and none of us even had any overlap, which was really fascinating, just the amount of images there are of her. So it's a really fun project and quite telling that something that is thrilling is just continuing to represent and look at Medusa, right? This sort of ability for others to continuously look at her from the safety of your page, I guess. I don't know what else you all want to say.
I think Edith Hamilton's mythology may have been one of the first chapter books that I read as a child that I can think. I mean, I know I read other things, but I know I read it multiple times. And I also love museums. I'm a museum junkie. I call myself a museum whore sometimes, which is, I have to stop doing that. But I love going to the Met, and I love going to, the Museum of Natural History. And I know there was an exhibit once at the Met where Medusa was featured, and it was called Dangerous Beauty. And the reason why I think comic books, besides being a comic book scholar and loving comic books and cosplaying, you forgot to mention we cosplay together. She's just trying to be really, trying to make you respect her more.
That's three other famous sisters.
Yes, it's three other famous weird sisters. The reason for comic books is because of the gutter, because of the bleed, because of the constraints. I love to create in constraints. And because Medusa, I'd like to reimagine or do a resistant reading to what a dangerous beauty is. And I think in comic books with the ability to maybe have different artists maybe perhaps do different, either different covers or different issues of it, we could portray her differently and just to show the multifaceted ways, because I think we're also thinking about what Medusa looks like. In my mind, I have a really specific vision of what she looks like. I see her as a mixed race woman wearing locks, and that's why there was a picture of I'm totally forgetting the name of the director who was Casey Lemons was up there. But then Mallory O'Meara showed me her ink of Millicent Patrick. I was like, holy shit, looks like Medusa. Anyway, so there's all these like different visions of who she is, but there's something. The reason why I'm thinking about Dangerous Beauty and the concept of the comic book is because there's something about like mixedness and mixed raceness that is also a different kind of a monstrosity where you don't really belong and you're being read and misread. And so I'm thinking like if these people have to be restaged or there's a reinstantiation of the narrative, right? Like what would be a really complex configuration for a woman to be in, right? And it's like you're not black enough, you're not white enough, you're not professional enough, but you're fucking gorgeous. But your hair is a problem. And I'm thinking here about the Crown Act that was passed in like 20. So there's all these like things in my head. But I think what I love about the comic is that all our preoccupations and obsessions can come through the pages. And comics will allow us to play with different artists.
Yeah, I love comics. Is this on? Yeah. I am not as much of a comics nerd or as experienced in comics, and it's actually, for me, it's not the first medium I would have thought of, but I'm really, really excited to get to work in it. For me, the preoccupation, I also read and reread Edith Hamilton so many times. Also Delaire's book of Greek myths with those beautiful illustrations, big watercolors.
Yeah, I have it.
Yeah. So obsessed that I went and got a degree in Greek and Latin philology as an undergrad. And a lot of my scholarship has been invested in translations, adaptations, reappropriations of classical myth and how those speak to their contemporary issues. And my work tends to focus on the early modern period, but I'm also obviously very interested in our current moment. But in terms of creative work, my background is in theater rather than comics. So this is a really exciting way of taking some aspects of the performative, the suspenseful, and the visual, but having them on the page in a more sort of accessible way, in a way that gives the reader more agency, right? Because we're not controlling the time that they spend reading it, but giving the reader something that they can just dive into.
So this is just a kind of practical question for thinking about artists for the comic. Black and white or color, and there's sort of two traditions. There's at the extremes, there's the Alan Moore, which is where you want someone who can bring the image that fulfills your script. And there's the Tony Blum, which is your script is a lot of launch points for an artist to carry the story. So, I mean, those are extremes, but just as a practical, where do you see yourselves, or have you thought about whether you want the artist, how you want the artist to be serving the story?
Ideally, I'd like to have a consistent artist throughout. I don't know color or black and white, but for the one-offs, I see us having different artists working for those sort of interstitial ones. So like every 3 issues, there's going to be a one-off of backstory. So that definitely would have different artists. I envision a consistent artist that we're working with for a consistent, recognizable look for the world, and maybe the cover art could vary with different cover artists. I don't know if that answered your question.
I mean, color would be preferable, although who knows where we could. I know that's expensive, so I would prefer color. But I think it's a matter of how and where we see it being able to be published and produced and how much that costs and all those things. So there's the practical questions. In terms of the interesting question you had about an artist kind of interpreting the script and the text versus an artist who's able to really clearly execute a specific vision. I think, at least for me, it would really depend on the artist and how our collaboration and connection is working. And so if it's someone who's really kind of vibing on our vision, for lack of a better word, and is really excited about it, I think I would be, and I don't want to speak for you two, but I would imagine we'd be in a similar position where I'd be more open to allowing it to be more of an interpretive project for them and giving them like having it be a suggestion, see what they come up with. If the artist is more of like a hired hand, not that that would be the case, obviously, but if it's more of like a person who is working because they want work and they're just, doing this project and less of a collaborative interlocutor, then I would think maybe executing the vision would be maybe more that relationship. So not to waffle, but I think it really depends on the kind of connection we're having and who that person really is and how we're seeing them in terms of the collaborative project.
We'll have to do their chart and see.
If they're Aquarius, then we can totally vibe with them. No, I'm joking. Okay.
Thank you so much. Kind of question about Medusa in particular. One of the really great things we see in the ancient Near East is that a lot of these monsters move into the Eastern Mediterranean and into Greek context. Pazuzu shows up on a mace head on Samos, and then the Epic of Gilgamesh, Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, that gets beheaded and kind of carried off his head as trophy and has these descriptions of his gaze and breath and being death. His protective elements get redistributed by the head of the pantheon to protect temples, and then his face becomes a plaque that has apotropaic functions, and then he wanders into overlap with Medusa in Crete, for example. The Met did this in their Assyria to Iberia show in 2014. They talked about this a bit. But so on the one hand, we have this fun intersection between this very masculine figure that has this similar function that overlaps with Medusa, but then also Medusa gets used protectively, right, in this apotropaic function. And is that something, I'm not very familiar with the later reception of Medusa, and is that something that also we see, this kind of protective quality that we see in her actual use in Greece show up later on in a talismanic purpose, or how does that also appear, if it does, in the reception?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the apotropaic quality is certainly there in the later versions of the Medusa myth the sort of latter part of the story where Athena places her head on the aegis, right? So on the shield, it becomes, I think, both an offensive and a defensive weapon, right? So it has that. And I love the word apotropaic because it's literally what you have to do with Medusa. You have to turn away and not look at her head on. In terms of the sort of talismanic use, I think there's a little bit of that. I'm honestly much less of an archaeology material culture person for that period, but I think that's certainly interesting. And I love that you brought up the overlap with the Near Eastern ancient cultures and civilizations. That's something that, for me particularly, I'm very interested in. As Kathy said, we are taking a global approach to these mythologies. And I, for one, am very interested in bringing in some ancient Near Eastern stuff. My own heritage is Lebanese, so I am super into all the Phoenician stuff. Like, if we can get Baal and Ishtar like hanging out with everyone else, that would be really cool. So those are absolutely things that we're thinking of, and that we'll be looking for ways to incorporate into the storytelling, both around Medusa and other figures.
It was actually kind of quick question for Frankie. So it sounds like this, when you said Helou, which is on my list to read now, is looking at colonialism, capitalism, and those sorts of things in the 20th century. Does it go back into the Victorian era at all?
Do you know what
Or the 19th century, I should say.
Yeah, the time period is really disturbingly specific in some ways. They talk about what's happening during World War I on that island, okay, and the idea that he was supposed to be giving away the medal that everyone was drawing, and instead he just picked small pieces off and gave that away. And that's when the rabbit has the line about the rich the rich give brass and the poor give blood. So it is so dang 20th century, and the fact that a cell phone does not show up in there, part of me really wanted it to be like occurring in, I don't know, the 90s or something. But it really is set as incredibly 20th century. And yet, I mean, there's this whole line about the white hunters moving through the Pacific Northwest. And I found myself Googling, when did Washington State become a state? Because it's not really part of my normal research. Yeah, it's so dang 20th century, from them playing jazz. I mean, these sentient animals are playing jazz, and they're drinking certain kinds of whiskey out of glasses that are very jazz era. So it's 20th century kind of threw up a little there.
Great, that
All
was
right.
perfect timing. We're at the end of the session time and break time. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank some really incredible panelists and discussion afterwards. Thank you so much to all of you.